Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the forum. We hope you enjoyed the many panels, keynotes, and lunches in today's program. A lot was discussed today, from gender inequality to energy needs, to foreign aid, to corruption, and others. Our hope is that you will have come away with lots of new knowledge and ideas to apply in your countries, communities, and institutions and your research.
Now we are very pleased to welcome Professor Kalestis Juma, who will be introducing our evening keynote. He is Professor of the Practice of International Development and Director of the Science, Technology, and Globalization Project. Among his many roles and accomplishments, he most recently authored an acclaimed book called The New Harvest, Agricultural Innovation in Africa. He is widely known and recognized for his work in sustainable development, and he is also simply one of the more beloved professors here at the Kennedy School. So please join us in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. I have the easiest task. I have a proposal actually, which is that since we have an audience, that I would like to propose that we just declare this event a success and ask people to go home. and there are two doors. There are two doors you can take. You will also notice something else, that our keynote speaker and myself are not wearing ties, and it's very deliberate. It's actually so that we can just have a conversation this evening. Yesterday and this morning, you had the opportunity to hear a lot about high-level macroeconomic aspects of development. And this has been a very important part of the development discourse over the last, I would say, 3-4 decades. But at the end of the day, somebody has to get to a very practical location and do something concrete, whether it's building a school, manufacturing a product, rescuing people. That at the end of the day, after you've set that framework, that you need more people engaged at the practical level doing something. And so there is a very direct connection between the macro and the micro, what happens at the micro level. But contrary to what we see in real practice, you get a lot of debates on whether it's micro or macro. So essentially what we have is a false dichotomy between the macro and the micro. And I can't think of a better person to help us think carefully through those connections than Professor Abhijit Banerjee, who is the professor and author of Poor Economics, but he's mostly known for his work that led the creation of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, which is really an attempt to connect basically the two layers of development, the macro and the micro. He has written extensively on this subject, honored by various organizations, and we are just very lucky to be able to have him to come and join us this evening, and he will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open up for a discussion. So I want you to do me a big favor, which is join me in inviting Professor Banerjee to join us and give his presentation. Now you're on your own.
It's the end of an intense day, and I sort of debated whether I should try to attempt to be, try to do something that I don't usually try to do, which is try to be entertaining or funny. But in the end, I decided I'm just a nerd, and I might as well be nerdy. So this is a very nerdy talk, and I hope it's sort of at least provide some closure to this very exciting program that you've been through, and maybe a format for some discussion of issues that you think should have been discussed. So let me jump in. So, okay, good. So basically, I think the starting point of what I wanted to sort of, what I want to do today is sort of talk through this question, which I think is implicit in a lot of discussions everywhere, which is sort of, how big a space is there left for micro once we take the importance of macro factors seriously. So that's sort of it's an implicit and sometimes explicit claim that it's, in the end you have to fix the macro factors, and then it isn't, and sort of, I think China is the example that's constantly thrown at us. It's an example in some ways. I've done some work on China, and so I would say that it's probably the least appropriate example sometimes, but it's an example that's always comes up, brought up, which is that, don't we know after China that the way you reduce poverty is by having growth? I think, and therefore, why don't we not worry about all this micro stuff? We just have to have growth. Now, I want to deconstruct that sentence. In the sense, the entire talk is, in a sense, an attempt at multiple levels to deconstruct that thought. So I want to begin by saying that, I think that claim is in some ways falls at three different levels. And the three levels are here. I wish I could see what's on the slide, because I can only see some. My eyes are clearly not as good as they should be. But assuming that I have the right slide up there. I think that falls at sort of three different levels. I think the first level at which it's not true is that we actually don't know that. Even the claim that in China that a lot of poverty reduction happened as a result of growth is at a prima facie level not obvious. So, for example, there's I think some interesting work showing that if you look at the 90s, which is a period of very fast growth in China, a very big chunk of poverty reduction happens in 2 years. What happens in those 2 years? Well, prices get changed. Agricultural prices used to be very low, and they get raised at some point, since a big fraction of the poorest people lived in rural areas. That had a massive effect on the income distribution. So this just as a prima facie fact, it's not true that all of the effect comes from something abstract called growth. I think that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. A second thing, which is I think less so, I think, and moreover, I think there's the sort of more general claim about, suppose we think that in China it was due to growth. Do we know how to, what piece of that was some unique China-specific phenomenon, and what was something more generalized? I think the more important point, though, is that there's a fundamental, sort of principle of economics which is forgotten when this claim is made. And that principle is that it's not about what even if it were true that growth was this the biggest single thing that matters. It's not that we, either as policymakers or as scholars, need necessarily to pursue that. Why? Because in the end, what matters is what we can affect, not what happens. So lots of things happen in the world which we cannot affect one way or the other. And the fact that those things are big doesn't mean that those things are all we should focus on. What we should focus on is what we can affect, not what we see looming out there, which is enormous. So it doesn't. So in some sense, the size is misleading, precisely because the size might precisely mean that we don't know how to affect that. And in some sense, I think the bottom line on I think the last 20 years of the literature on growth theory is that we know next to nothing about how to generate growth. I think we know something very precise about how to destroy growth. North Korea knows how to do it. But if you go from, leave out the Albania under Anwar Shikoza or North Korea under Kim Il-sung. I mean, these are exceptional cases. But if you take the rest of the set of countries and you try to actually look at, can I predict growth in these countries with policies they adopted? The answer is essentially no. So once you control for some institutional variable, this is Danny Roderick's work. Wait for a minute. This is Danny Roderick's work. It is, once we control for the quality of the institutions in these different countries, more or less nothing else is significant. So you can put in any number of growth policies in the regression and you find that, sometimes one will show up as significant, another, sometimes something else will show up significant, but mostly nothing robustly shows up. So we basically don't know. Now what do we know? We know institutions are good, but what do we know about how to generate those institutions? Well, there we know next to nothing. What we know, interestingly, is from for example, my colleague Darun Asimoglu's work, which is Asimoglu and Jim Robinson's work, which is, I think, very interesting and very illuminating. What it tells us is that countries that had, at the point of colonization, the first settlers didn't die, were countries where basically more kind of European settlers settled, and those countries do better today. Now, what do you make of that fact? Depends on, I think, on a number of other things you're willing to assume. So what a lot of people make of that fact is that means that the European people generated the right kind of institutions, and those right kinds of institutions are supposed to be institutions like property rights. Now, that might well be true, but it could also be that the European people brought with them their culture, their education, their sense of what the right ways to run economies are. Maybe just the fact that they came and obliterated lots of native populations is what matters. In some sense, you are not able to distinguish between those things. And even if you could, so at this point, at the macro level, the only really robust facts we know is that if we could go back in time 400 years and we could kind of get some settlers to settle who were of a particular kind, we're going to get a good outcome. Now that's not a particularly actionable piece, right? I don't know, if you know that, what do you do? Beyond that, I think there's lots of claims about what we know, like, this is because of property rights or something, but those are claims which are essentially not founded in the evidence that's adduced for it. They are correlated with it, but lots of things are. If you look at the countries where the property rights are better, people speak better English or French. How do I know? So you have to have some premise that's already embedded in your head to interpret those facts. So that's I think the second point. And the third point, and this is what I will spend a little bit more time about, is that imagine that this were true, and imagine that indeed we actually took seriously the idea that our goal is to promote growth. I think thinking about that question as a macro question is misleading. So let me spend a little bit of time making that case. That's a more complicated case. So I want to make the point that even if I were convinced that what I need to do is promote growth, and that's somehow something that is feasible so that the knowledge for that can be gathered, would the knowledge that I would gather for that be macro knowledge? So that's the third of my three no's. So let me now so what have we learned from the empirical studies? So good, this I've said already a little bit, which is that we don't really know very much. So I'll skip this and go to the next slide, which is that even at the level of, not just at the level of causality, we know very little that's causal, and we know even less at some level, or not even less, but even remarkably, we don't even know very much about descriptively what explains growth. So if you actually wanted to tell us what was common among countries that grew, just descriptively, not something between a third and 80% of the variation can be explained, depending on what you are willing to assume. So, and what is that assumption about? It's about how to measure education. So is it primary education that we should put into the description of a country, secondary education, tertiary education? Depending on which choice you make, you can explain anything between 30% and 80% of the variation. So that says that even descriptively, we don't know what does a country that grows well look like? That's a descriptive question. Even that question we really don't have a very good handle on. So, I mean, that sort of brings us, I think, to the contrast with, and the sort of point I was trying to make at the beginning, and I'll come back to this question of, how do we build macro knowledge in a minute. So, that is. Just to emphasize, that is not to say that nothing can be learned. I think we know a lot about many things. We are actually, the last 15 years have been very good for learning about many specific things. We know, what microcredit does and doesn't do. We know what water purification does and doesn't do. We know how difficult it is to get people to adopt good agricultural technologies. So we know a bunch of stuff. It's not that we haven't. So the claim that I'm making, the claim that while macro knowledge is rather difficult to achieve, other forms of knowledge are relatively easy to get. So going back to the sort of the principle I was articulating of kind of comparative advantage, our job is not, because even if it were true that macro knowledge was the most, if we knew it, it would be great, it's not very easy to know. Whereas there's all kinds of knowledge out there which is achievable and within reach. And in that sense, there is a sense in which we often get, I think, too entranced by the fact that if I could only solve this problem, everything will be solved, without putting enough weight on how easy is it to solve that problem. So that's sort of a thought to keep in mind. I'm going to a little bit sell this micro knowledge. I think there's a set of issues that people often. So a lot of this knowledge comes from experimental studies, and I think there is a claim which is that somehow this form of knowledge is somehow less generalizable than macro knowledge. Now, as I said, there is very little macro knowledge. But I think it's worth thinking about that claim even on its own grounds. I think that's true of every form of knowledge. I think David Hume pointed out in 1780 that you can't generalize unless you're willing to make some assumption. Everything, no setting is exactly like another, and that's true. I think somehow there's a sense in which there's a sense that because knowledge, when I look at the correlation between the growth rate and trade policy, because I'm comparing countries, that knowledge is somehow more general. But in fact, each of those countries is, so in the end, when I look at where that relationship is identified from, which countries am I comparing, those countries are going to be different in 15 other different ways. So it's not the case that when I actually get down to it, it is that, it's the average country with trade policy A with the average country trade policy B that I'm going to end up comparing. I'm going to end up comparing a subset of countries where the trade policy really has varied a lot, and those countries are not necessarily any more general than anything else. And sort of, I think the example of China, which is often used to make these kinds of points, illustrates that very well. I mean, you think of a Chinese trade policy, it's completely, it's kind of a unique policy that basically, with an undervalued exchange rate, which is financed by an amazing savings rate, which then is probably related to some other phenomenon, such as maybe the fact there's a one-child policy and therefore parents are really paranoid about having no support. So, if you think about where the Chinese trade policy is located, it's not actually located in the trade policy itself. It's located somewhere else, which is that it's a trade policy that's pursued vigorously precisely because China has a pot of savings somewhere which can be used to buy up foreign currency in large quantities and therefore keep the Chinese currency undervalued. So if you think about that, so I think the question of generalizability is always there. And I think what makes, many of the micro claims, look sort of less generalizable is that they come from, they're one study done in one place. And that's true. But on the other hand, precisely because they're one study done in one place, you could actually test the hypothesis of generalizability. Precisely because you can then say, look, I don't believe it's going to work in some other place. And I can go there and try it. And if it doesn't work, we learn something. If it works, we learn something. So in some sense, precisely the fact that this one study in one place makes the hypothesis of generalizability testable. Whereas if you say that, I'm going to use, the data from the whole world, then in some sense, there isn't a second world where I could go test it. So you're always much more limited in how much generalizability you can achieve. This is a more subtle point, which is also important to emphasize, which is that when we look at the reason why a lot of debates never end is because we're always able to adduce some other missing factor. The advantage of experimental knowledge is that typically that's one thing that's taken care of. You basically know that one thing is sort of, what the effect of the intervention you're making in the population you're looking at is precisely measured. By contrast, you get many things the fact that I can in many different data sets, I can find a correlation between educated mothers and the child's health. The fact that I observe it in 50 different populations doesn't make it any more powerful than if I observe it in one. Because they're all driven by the same missing variable. The fact that, maybe the reason why the mother gets educated is something to do with, all kinds of other things that are in the environment. For example, schools are available and hospitals are available in the same place. So there's a sense in which the problem of learning from purely from correlations is not just a problem of, getting enough data. It's sort of a problem that in some sense is built into the nature of learning. Let me skip a couple of slides and come to the last claim I want to make. The last claim I want to make is that, in a sense, we know something more than this. We actually know that even the fact that macro knowledge is sort of, imagine I wanted to do macro policy. How would I found that macro policy? Where would I get the knowledge relevant for that? And I want to make the claim that even that knowledge won't come from studying the macro institution. So, and what's been interesting the last 10 years of growth economics is that it's very sort of very interesting piece of evidence, a set of work where the whole macro field has moved towards away from kind of macro, looking at macro evidence. Let me illustrate why that's happened. So the reason why that's happened is because a set of facts came up which were kind of disturbing. The facts are of the following kind. I'm illustrating. There are many different versions of this, and there are more or less rigorous way to do it. But one set of facts seem to be that there are lots of people who seem to have very high rates of return on their investment. The best example, I'll skip some of this since I'm going to run out of time and I want to stop on schedule, is from a bunch of randomized experiments where basically these experiments are very simple. You go to a random set of firms, you give them $200, you look at what happens to their earnings. And earnings go up by 10, 15% per month, at least 5, 7, 10% per month, which are huge returns, 80, 90% returns on investments. Okay, so those are massive, massive returns. Now, if you look at what happens when a country adds more capital, that's another way to look at that question. So, when I give a firm an extra $200, what happens to its returns? There are many different ways to look at that question. Many people have studied it. I've studied it. So you get, with a lot of firms, you get high returns. Then there is a separate question, which is what happens if I look at the country as a whole as a unit? When I look at the country as a whole as a unit, you find that it's actually, there are many simple things you can do. One is look at what is called the incremental capital output ratio. What's the incremental capital output ratio? Basically it's the obvious thing. The country added $100 more capital in its GDP statistics, and how much does GDP go up by? You divide the two, you get an incremental capital output ratio. Now these are very related things, right? This is basically saying the country added $100 of capital. How much more output did it get? That number turns out to be pretty small. So when a country like India or Tanzania or many such countries, you look at these numbers, it's clear that these numbers sort of don't vary a lot. Most countries, when they add $100 more capital, they get about 20 cents more of output. Now, how do you square these facts? It's simply on one side, when an individual firm, we find this experimental evidence that in the individual firms that are getting inflows of capital seem to get 80% returns, but the country as a whole gets 20% returns. So how do you square those facts? That's sort of what created, I think, move in macro towards looking at these questions. And I think the answer to that question is that it has to be that basically there must be some firms out there, the ones who, maybe the large firms, which are very unproductive. So certain kinds of firms must be out there, so if you have the average return on capital, when the country adds $100, it gets 20 cents more, but we find a set of firms which get 80 cents more, then there will be some firms which are getting 10 cents on the dollar. That's how they'll average out to be 20 cents. So it must be the case that basically there is massive misallocation. Capital in these countries, some places there must be very high returns, some places there must be very low returns. And then the same fact must be true in education as well. There must be many talented people who have no education and a lot of untalented people who parents have money and therefore they persist in school, they get degrees, they get some, but they are not the right people to be educated. So there must be within the set of all of you are the right people, but there must be the case that I think this is a fact that's been jumping out at us for a while. We've not noticed, but I think now finally the macro field has sort of suddenly woken up to it, and you see a whole bunch of conferences. I went one this week on this question of misallocation. Why am I emphasizing that? I'm emphasizing that because once you take that seriously, then the question becomes basically one of I'm going to skip all this stuff. This is somewhat detailed. So basically, what this says is that resource reallocation is a key piece of growth. So growth happens. A lot of why China grew fast is China had a lot of resources which were in the wrong place. And they got moved to the right place, which is why China grew fast. So there were a lot of talented people who were not doing anything, a lot of land that was not being used in the most efficient way. So a lot of what happens within countries as they grow is not that these countries sort of get some macro change. It's not that the countries suddenly become, if you think of how a macroeconomist thinks about a country, this country has more capital or more labor or more human capital. It's not as if somebody comes and drops more of these things on those countries. What happens is actually the country starts using what it has better. That's why we can't explain using macro variables why some countries are richer than others. Because why? Because most of it has nothing to do with how much resources you have, but how well you use them. And once you recognize that fact, then a lot of things fit, but also changes the problem entirely. So then the question is, even at the macro level, the question comes into how do you reallocate resources faster? How do you induce resources to go to the right places? How do you get the talented students to be brought into school? If you think that there is, how do you get the talented entrepreneurs to have the capital? How do you get the medium firms to become the giant firms they need to be? So it all becomes a question, or a lot of it becomes a question not of within the economy fixing things. Now, once you take that seriously, a lot of things will change. For example, that says that the process of growth is going to be a process of which have lots of winners and losers. Why? Because some people are sitting on resources, some people are getting into schools that they shouldn't be getting into, other people deserve that but they don't get it. So when that's true, then you're going to see massive reallocations across the economy and massive resentment. So both at the political level and at the economic level, the key to thinking about growth is how do you manage a process where lots of things move. So if you look at what is happening in China, for example, the big political factor about China over the last 7-8 years has been all these land riots. What are land riots? Land riots are the symptom of a process of reallocation. People had land, there was industry that wanted land, the state came and grabbed the land and gave it to them. Now, that's in different forms, every country does that, but it's the fact that that becomes now a central piece of the political process is telling us something about where the growth is coming from. It's coming from reallocating resources across people. How do we manage that? How do we make sure that that doesn't create governance problems that then undermine the entire growth process? So how do we make sure that this then creates, because there's so many, land grabs create all kinds of political pressures. How do we make sure that those political pressures are managed, for example? So if you once you take that view, then in some sense, even to promote growth, what we need to do really, if we want to grow, we need to understand how to identify and invest in talent, how to redesign the financial environment so that the talented entrepreneurs get the capital, not the people who have the connected fathers. How do we compensate the winners, losers, and tax the winners? Because that's what's going to, the big story is going to be that, which is that there will be big winners and big losers, and you'll have to somehow manage that process. How do you design institutions that make that happen? So it's not a question of, I can't go and make fair allocations happen. You have to design institutional controls on that. How do you do that? But remember those are not going to be institutions in the sort of capital, democracy sense. That, we know that they might very well be, democracy might very well be an important part of the story, but in the end, within democratic institutions, there will be different forms of control that will be given. For example, in local government, do local governments decide who uses land? Or is it the case that the central government decides? So there will be a set of decisions which will be the small I institutions and not the big I institutions. So at some level, all of these are things that we can actually innovate, test, and improve. So in that sense, I'm going to sort of say in closure that I think this whole conversation about, somehow there's some macro way to promote growth and then there is something else is entirely spurious in my view. In the end, when you want to promote growth, you have to take a set of steps. You have to have better schools. How do you get better schools? You have to, in the end, take a set of decisions about, what are the best ways to use resources within the school? How do I find the best talent to get into the school? I have to find different ways to test people. These are questions that we're going to have to solve. We're not going to say that, we need better human capital to generate growth is sort of mostly an empty statement, because that's not actually actionable. How do I get better human capital? What's actionable is I'm going to change the syllabus. I'm going to change the syllabus in a particular way. High schools will teach chemistry in this way or that. That's how we're going to get better human capital. We're going to change the high school entry procedures. We're going to change the scholarships in the high schools. We're going to change the teacher training. All of those things are not decisions which will have to be made at a very specific micro level. None of those decisions are can be taken at some global, it's not enough. In other words, we can't just say, let's get human capital, and somehow that will generate it. We'll in the end have to intervene in one way or the other. So in some sense, I find this whole conversation, even if you take this premise that that's what you're trying to achieve, that growth is what you're trying to achieve, and that that there is a way to do that, if you take both of those, which I'm not entirely compelled by, or always compelled by sometimes, yes, I would say even there's lots of slippage. So let me end on that. So that's sort of maybe the one sentence summary of what I wanted to say.
Don't sit down. This is.
I thought you were going to take over. No.
That's why I don't want you to go away. This is really very inspirational to just hear you offer a very pragmatic view, really, of how to think about development. And I can now understand why our good organizers had the judgment to separate you with the earlier session by almost 12 hours. And
not only.
I suspect so. And so this is the most interesting part, where you get to ask questions. And we have microphones, one microphone here, and another one over there. And you can just line up behind the microphones. And I want you to do me a really big favor, which is to keep it short. And I heard somebody define a question as a logical sequence of words with a question mark at the end. And so please, another favor you could do us, please don't lecture us, because the two of us are capable of lecturing you out of the room. so I can speak for myself. So just really keep it short so that we can have a good conversation with Professor Banerjee. So anybody who is ready to go? Or yes, please.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Ryan Martin. I'm from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Speaking of human capital, making micro decisions, I would like to hear your thoughts about conditional cash transfers. And I know that JPAL is actually evaluating a World Bank project in Morocco right now, which is very interesting, and the evaluation that you're doing is comparing the treatment and control groups, which I think is very important. But especially with conditional cash transfers, I think the question is what happens when the money stops? And is JPAL doing an evaluation of what happens, or what has happened after the World Bank money stopped?
Since it's not stopped yet.
So it has continued.
Yeah, I think so I think that's a good way to get to a point that I should have made, which is that you can never learn anything without some theoretical framework that you have in your head. So when I ask the question, what does a conditional cash transfer do? What you're asking is, if I give people money and tell them, this money is for education, what does it do to people's education investment? Now, where that money comes from might matter, but prima facie, our theory is that this doesn't matter very much. It could be the Moroccan government, it could be some other government, some other donor who gives it. I think we think money, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar, and therefore the answer to that. So we want to know, is it the case that if I tell people that, here's some money that you can get if you send your children to school, people respond to that? And so what that study actually shows is very interesting. It shows something that's come up and we don't know the answer to why it's going on. That's sort of one of the things, the nice things about experiments, is that they can surprise you. Because you can you don't come in, you don't put a structure on the problem that sort of precludes you from finding out things that you didn't expect. So one thing that people have found in Morocco, but also in other studies, that it doesn't just seem to matter whether it's conditional or not. So if you tell people that, look, this money is for education, but actually don't enforce any rules, they still seem to spend more or less the same amount on it. So why do people, if it's the case that this money is essentially untied, why do people spend it on education? And that's puzzling, but people have found the same thing in Malawi as well. Another study found the same thing. So at this point, I think what seems clear. So what do I take away from this set of cities? I mean, what I take away is that parents are actually, and they've also found, the other thing that comes out a lot of the CCTs, very interestingly, is that it doesn't really matter, amount doesn't seem to matter. So $3 and $10 seem to generate the same per month, which are hugely different amounts of money in Malawi, seem to generate the same response pretty much. So it doesn't seem to matter how much money. So you tell people, send your children to school to give you money. It doesn't seem to matter how much. So all of those are posing extremely difficult puzzles for a very classical economic structure of thinking about this problem. Because it suggests that what parents are actually, what seems to matter is more the salience of that this is generating. There's someone putting education front and center rather than the money itself. Because otherwise you would think that if it's really a matter of buying the parents' allegiance, then you would think that the amount of money would matter. Because I would say, look, I'm not to be bought for $3, I'm to be bought for $10. But in fact, it seems to be the parents are willing to do it, but they somehow, this just makes it salient. So it's a very interesting domain, because I think that it's a domain where we will learn something, I think, which I don't think we set out to find out. We're learning something about parental motivation which we didn't expect. And I think that's sort of a very nice thing about experiments, is that we end up kind of refining our view of the world as we go. And that's, I think, in the end, how do we design good policy? Well, we partly, because there's a billion policy options possible. So we need to learn about how the world works. Otherwise, we'll never get all the options that we need. So in some sense, it's a very interesting stage that project is in, this CCT project, which is that, I think people have now found things that they didn't expect, and they're scratching their head. And I think we're going to learn something very interesting from that, but I don't know what it is, but I would already be pushing it.
Okay, good. So,
hi, my name is James. I'm an MPP, one here at the Kennedy School. Thank you so much for coming. It's a privilege to have somebody who's contributed so much both to public discourse and to policy address the school. So my question is kind of a hesitation about the potential of randomized control trials. I think of all the people here, I'd say perhaps maybe half are interested in economic development, and other people are interested in things like human rights development or gender empowerment. What I find anyway is that the randomized control trial system has a potential to distort how we motivate policy. So because a randomized control trial can tell that building a road is successful, but it might not be so good at telling whether or not a gender empowerment program might be successful, what happens to see, you happen to see in like international organizations, for example, is that there's a preference for those kind of those kind of projects. And what are your, I'm wondering what your reservations are about the ability of your discipline or your methodology to really motivate policy in a broad way, or do you think that there's a risk really that because like the functional form of the causality has a kind of unpredictable manner in certain types of projects, that we end up only doing the projects that are clear to see?
Interesting. I would have almost given the opposite example, because that's, I think, it's much harder to do a randomized control trial of road construction than of gender empowerment. I mean, gender empowerment is some set of actions you take, and there are many such projects of different kinds. If you think that, for example, reservations in jobs for women, or subsidies for girls to go to school, there's all kinds of different interventions. Roads are much harder to do CCTs on because there aren't enough of them, and they tend to be connected to other roads, so they're much harder to do sort of RCTs on roads than on gender empowerment, and there are many more on gender empowerment than on roads. Now, having said that, reversing your question, do I think there's too few on roads? I think the answer is yes. There are probably too few on roads, and maybe there is, in a sense, too much emphasis on gender empowerment. I don't think it's actually true, but if anything, I would put your question in that direction, because if anything, it's much easier to do it on gender empowerment, because that's as long as something's a program, meaning that it's a set of specific interventions, and it has an outcome that you can define, you can do an RCT. The problem is typically that a road is not a separable intervention, because it's like, this road is connected to that road, that's connected to that bridge, so it's not a separable intervention. It makes it much harder to do. So people tend to not do RCTs on roads, and there are very few on roads. In fact, I don't know of one completed. There are a couple of ongoing ones, there's not a single completed ones on roads. And so that's that in a sense is the problem you're alluding to is a real one, which is that what we can measure often defines what we do, and we need to be careful about that. I don't think the specific example, I think, is probably not the most relevant.
Okay, I don't see anybody anxious to ask you a question, so I'll abuse my privilege to ask you a question that you don't have to answer, actually.
That's even better.
Yeah, which is you spend quite a bit of time saying a lot of important things that we don't know. And then your methodology has to do with the randomized trials, which is a methodology that I associate with the medical profession. And my question is, if we, especially in macroeconomics, there are so many things we don't know, and yet we are starting to use methodologies that come from the medical profession. Does that lead one to the conclusion that maybe we should get people from the medical profession to do more work on development?
I suspect not. The one thing we are better than the medical profession, a lot better, is statistics. Medical profession is not great. So I would probably stay.
This is completely off the record. If you tweet it, well, I'll say you made it up. Okay, I think we're done with this. I've just had a way of ending this session in the most dignified way. By asking a question for which you cannot give a straight answer. Maybe we'll have an answer to that question in a few months. So I want to ask you again to give Professor Banerjee a big hand.
Thank you, Professor Juma, and thank you, Professor Banerjee, for your insightful remarks. You've been an inspiration to many of us with your bold, pioneering, and rigorous evidence-based approach to research, as we've just heard. And you've left us with many new ideas, and I would also say a challenge. I think to think harder about development, and to not be afraid to ask, to not be afraid to experiment, and to go against the grain of received wisdom, and to embrace innovation as a tool for finding more effective development interventions and policies that work. At this time, we'd like to pass the stage to the organizers of the case competition to present awards for this afternoon's sessions. So we have three presenters. Catherine Lucy, who was the leader for the Sustainable Solutions for Local Development competition. Eileen de Ravine, who was the Empowering Women case competition. And Patrick Lee, who headed the Tackling Child Mortality competition. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Catherine Lucy. I'm the founder and CEO of Solar Sister. And the case that I was judge along with Justin Sosney from the State Department was a case on Solar Sister. The teams did a great job of taking a look at Solar Sister as a new social enterprise, and they took a look at some of the challenges that we face in scaling up and bringing our project to greater impact in East Africa. And we judged the competition. We had 5 teams. And the winner was based on a combination of, we felt, a good grasp of the issues of gender empowerment and market-based strategies, and also coming up with some creative solutions, and also a very professional and polished presentation, which was pretty tough to do within the short time frame that they had to work on all this. So the winning team was team number 5 in the Solar Sister group. And that is Julia Nain, Lily Shen, and Takua Sato. Team number 5 here. Oh, is the rewards later? Okay.
Hi, my name is Eileen Duravin. I manage the Equator Initiative, a project at the United Nations Development Program. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Kalestis Juma here, who was one of the creators of this project 10 years ago. So it's nice to see you again. We did a project that actually evaluated nominations for the Equator Initiative. We had 6 teams. They did a great job in, as you said, a very short time, and they were really good at keeping to the presentation time, so well done with the 6 teams. This was really about the nexus of the win-win environment for sustainable development and environmental conservation. So that's, I'm happy to say that the winning team for the very difficult choice was team number 2, and the team members are Yun Chen, Gloria Malia Mahama, Consuelo Fernandez, Ji Chang, and Carlos Eduardo Villados V. So we'll see them up here in a few minutes.
Hi, my name is Patrick Lee. I'm with USAID. I'm a program specialist there. And we did the taste competition on tackling child mortality. The Indian alternative about the ICDS program, the Indian Development. Oh man, I just blanked on that. So the winning team here was actually team 2, Kateki Desai, Danning Chen, and Jume Akadele. Congratulations.
So all the people who've just received these wonderful prizes are asked to come to the stage at the end of the session to pick up their certificates. Thank you.
We have a few brief announcements. First, we ask that any of the conference materials that you do not intend to save, please recycle them in the recycling bins around the forum. Second, at the end of this session, we invite you all to a reception at the MIT Museum, which is about a 25-minute walk or a short cab ride away. It should should be a nice opportunity to be in an informal setting. There'll be hors d'oeuvres and cocktails. Directions and a map can be found in the back of the program. We'd ask that panelists and workshop leaders please meet in the faculty dining room at the end of this session. We'd like to acknowledge again our gold sponsors, Chevron and Green Gulf, and our media sponsor, DevEx, who made the conference possible. And most importantly, we'd also like to thank you guys, the participants, for joining us today. Some of you are local to Harvard or Boston. Some of you traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles from places like Afghanistan, Chile, India, or Qatar. The conference has been immensely enriched by your knowledge and diverse perspectives. Thank you for being part of this.
A final big thank you goes to the IDC team, the more than 50 volunteers that have worked tirelessly for the past 6 months to make this conference happen. We owe each of you individually a big thank you. And the conference could really not have been possible without you, so let's give them a hand. On behalf of the Kennedy School and the Harvard community, we'd like to thank you for joining us for the 18th Annual International Development Conference at Harvard, and we really hope to see you again this time next year. I declare this conference closed. Thank you. It's not quite closed because we have the MIT cocktails, but
it's also not quite closed because I'd like to call also Anna up to the stage. And just a brief moment of recognition for our chairs and for our head of operations for making today such a spectacular day.
Thank you guys. See you at the MIT Museum.